In early modern times, Europe was a hotbed of strife, with dynastic and religious wars and revolts boiling over. A unique figure emerged against this backdrop: the Landsknecht, the German mercenary, expert in the spear and the arquebus, with a distinctive style. We can only imagine an army of skilled, disciplined warriors, but with a passion for fancy dress and a taste for mayhem off the battlefield. Well, these guys certainly were not easy to handle. This video will plunge us into the world of the Landsknechts mercenaries, looking at their history, organization, lifestyle, and the impact they had on military history. Be prepared for a trip back in time, with lots of action, questionable clothing, and a touch of dry humor. Because, after all, these mercenaries were quite the characters. The term Landsknecht is literally servants of the land. However, do not be fooled. These servants were far from compliant. They emerged at the end of the 15th century, inspired by the Swiss pikemen who were popular at the time. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, having seen the potential of those Swiss warriors carrying giant spears, mused, "I want myself some of these." So, with the aid of experienced Swiss mercenaries, the Reichsläufer, the first Landsknechts, began to be trained. But these Germans were not only copies of the Swiss. They had their own twist to the recipe, with innovative tactics, such as ambushes, camouflages, and even smokescreens. Indeed, they were creative, and a bit daring. Ultimately, they were mercenaries and would fight for the highest bidder, even if it were against the Emperor himself. Can you imagine the look on Maximilian I's face when he found out? But what made the Landsknechts so unique? Well, other than their ability with spears up to 5.5 meters long, which, to be honest, were not easy to handle, they mastered weapons like the halberd and the Zweihander, a two-handed sword that could weigh up to 6 kilograms. Oh, these guys must have had steel biceps! The Landsknechts were not only a bunch of men with gigantic spears and swords that looked like twisted pieces of iron. They also knew how to use firearms expertly, including arquebuses. And do not think that it was just a matter of shooting ahead and then seeing what became of them. They were one of the first to effectively integrate firearms into infantry units, changing the face of European warfare. By the end of the 15th century, arquebuses were still dull, slow, and inaccurate, but the Landsknechts spotted the potential of these fire sticks to give enemies a good thrashing from a distance. They joined the firepower of the arquebusiers with cover of the pikemen, making an unbeatable duo. Whilst the pikemen made a wall of spears, the arquebusiers poured a hail of fire down on the enemies. This combination was ideal for dealing with the heavy cavalry that had dominated the battlefields until then. The pikemen would hold off the cavalrymen, and the arquebusiers would give them shock treatment. They used formations with 2 rows of arquebusiers, and the first knelt for the second to fire over the top. What if things got rough and the enemy drew near? No problem. They would use the butt of the arquebus to beat the crap out of the enemy. The arquebus was a versatile tool. It could shoot and crack skulls. Flexibility was the key quality of the Landsknechts. They adjusted to the terrain, the enemy, and the circumstances, changing their formations and tactics as needed. For example, in rough terrain, they split their formations into smaller groups to move more quickly. Using pikes against heavy cavalry, they would form an impenetrable wall, while arquebusiers and crossbowmen attacked from a distance. And we must not forget the clothing. Ah, clothes! While other armies wore sober, practical uniforms, the Landsknechts marched in a wild carnival of color and exuberance. Puffed sleeves, eye-catching garments, vibrant fabrics. They seem to have stepped out of a Renaissance fashion show, not onto a battlefield. But how did this style come about? Well, it was 1477, after a particularly bloody battle, believe it or not. Having their clothes torn and battered, the Landsknechts had the bright idea of patching them with scraps of fabric from enemy uniforms and flags. The result? A unique look that blended colors, textures, and a touch of avant-garde deconstruction ages ahead of its time. To complete the look, They wore extravagant hats, tight pants, and square-toed boots, known as cow's snout or bear's paw. To make sure their style was always flawless, they organized real fashion shows at the campsites with a jury and all. But do not think it was just a shambles. The Landsknechts were a complex military organization with regiments, companies, and a strict hierarchy. And most interestingly, they took part in the election of their officers. Democracy in the military? Who would have thought? This autonomy was uncommon for the time and gave the Landsknechts significant bargaining power. They bargained for better salaries, working conditions, and even swayed decisions in battle. And poor bastards who failed to keep their end of the bargain. After all, no one wanted to see a mob of angry pikemen knocking on their door. These German mercenaries left a mark on almost all of Europe. They battled in the Italian Wars, the German Peasants' War, the Siege of Vienna, and many more conflicts. In Pavia in 1525, they were instrumental in the victory of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V against the French. In 1529, at the Siege of Vienna, they fought to defend the city against the Ottomans. But their involvement in conflicts went far beyond these famous examples. If a nobleman needed seasoned troops and was okay with a few eccentricities, well, the Landsknechts were available. It should be remembered that they were not always victorious. At the 1513 Battle of Novara, fighting alongside the French, they were defeated by the Swiss mercenaries, their arch-enemies, and many of the men were executed. But they would get their revenge later by defeating the Swiss at the battles of Marignano and Bicocca. Whichever side had a good fight and a deep pocket of cash to pay them, they would be there. But no chance of ever duping these guys. In 1527, following several months of non-payment, the Landsknechts revolted and sacked Rome. Bloodshed and destruction were the result. The episode sullied the mercenaries' reputation and showed that discipline went out the window when it came to money. The Landsknechts' life was a roller coaster. Military discipline, bloody fighting, but also plenty of drinking, gambling, and, let's say, female company. They all lived in camps with their families, forming a traveling community behind the army. The atmosphere was chaotic and convivial. Brothel owners would rub their hands in glee when they saw a band of German mercenaries coming their way, always ready to shed some of the silver the fighters had in their pockets. Keeping up this lifestyle was not easy, and when the paycheck was late, looting was often a way of covering one's income or taking revenge on a cowardly leader. Once war ended, many became vagrants or formed gangs of thieves, prowling around Europe waiting for new opportunities to arise to provide their services. For all their contradictions, the Landsknechts left an important legacy. They had an impact on military tactics, fashion, yes, believe me, and even art. Their organization, with soldiers involved in decision-making, was innovative for the time. And what about their extravagant clothes? Well, they inspired a few Renaissance fashion designers. Or at least they got a good laugh. The Landsknechts were resourceful warriors, ambitious mercenaries, and controversial figures. Their story is a reminder that, behind every battle and every uniform, there are complex people with their own dreams, dilemmas, and oddities. Sometimes history is written with spears, arquebuses, and puffed sleeves.
Imagine a place where war was not regarded as a human tragedy, but rather as a lucrative business. A land divided, where wealthy, powerful cities placed no trust in their own citizens to fight, preferring instead to outsource their battles. That was the Italian peninsula in the 15th century, a land of dazzling paradoxes. The soil from which beauty seemed to sprout from the very stone, where geniuses such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were redefining art and science. It was the cradle of the Renaissance, an epicenter of innovation and a cultural explosion that would illuminate the world. Yet beneath the gilded veneer, Italy was a fractured, dangerous place, perpetually at war. Italy was not a unified nation. It was a chaotic mosaic of city-states, duchies, and republics. Florence, with its banking might. Venice, queen of the seas. Milan, the military bastion. The Papal States in Rome, wielding both spiritual and temporal power. Each of these powers was independent, immensely wealthy, and consumed by a paranoid distrust of its neighbors. Peace was only an interlude, a brief gasp for air, before the next inevitable military campaign. In such a setting, war was an instrument of policy, a tool of commerce, a season of the year. And in this singular marketplace, where violence was the most valuable commodity, a class of men arose who would become its undisputed masters. They fought not for a king, for God, or for a homeland. They fought on contract. They were the greatest military entrepreneurs the world had ever seen. They were known as the Condottieri. They were not mere hired swords. They were generals, CEOs of private military companies, who rented out their armies, their expertise, and their ruthlessness to the highest bidder. For almost 200 years, they were arbiters of power in Italy. Their banners were more feared than those of princes and popes. Their decisions on the battlefield would conjure duchies overnight or erase a republic from the map. To understand how an entire land outsourced its wars, we must step back in time. 14th century Italy was the playground of foreign powers. The emperors of the Holy Roman Empire to the north and the popes in Rome were locked in a struggle for control of the peninsula. The constant tug-of-war fragmented power still further, allowing the northern states to flourish in a vacuum of central authority. They grew rich and autonomous. Traditionally, these cities defended themselves with citizen militias. When the city bell rang the alarm, bakers, weavers, and notaries would drop their tools, seize spear and shield, and march to defend the walls. But as those cities became hubs of nascent capitalism, that notion grew ever more impractical. A Florentine silk merchant had no desire to risk his life on a months-long campaign, leaving his lucrative business behind. Moreover, warfare itself was becoming more complex, demanding a level of skill and training a part-time citizen simply did not possess. The solution was pragmatic: hire specialists. At first, those specialists were predominantly foreigners. Mercenary companies, idle during pauses in the 100 Years' War between England and France, crossed the Alps in search of employment. There were groups such as the Great Company, formed by Germans and Hungarians, or the feared White Company, led by the Englishman Sir John Hawkwood. They were battle-hardened soldiers, consummate professionals who brought to Italy a degree of military organization and discipline never before seen. They terrorized the countryside, looting and extorting, yet they proved invaluable to the lords who could afford their services. Seeing the success and wealth amassed by those foreigners, Italian military leaders soon realized they could do the same, only better. Figures such as Alberico da Barbiano formed the first companies composed entirely of Italians, creating a native school of war. At that moment, the system matured and crystallized around a central document, the Condotta. This was no handshake deal. A Condotta was an extraordinarily detailed legal contract. It specified the active service period, known as the ferma, and often included a retainer period with reduced pay, the aspetto, during which the employer decided whether to renew. It stipulated the precise number of cavalry lances and infantry soldiers to be provided. It set terms of payment, bonuses for victories, and even compensation for wounds or death. Clauses forbade the condottiero from fighting against his former employer for as long as 2 years after the contract ended, an attempt to curb constant side-switching. To ensure compliance, city-states often sent their own officials, the collaterali, to accompany the army, audit troop numbers, and make sure the general was not inflating headcounts to pocket extra cash. War had, in every sense, become a legally regulated profession. The condottiero was no longer merely a warrior, he was an armed business partner. So what exactly did a condottiero's army look like? The backbone, the most valuable asset, was the heavy cavalry. And the fundamental unit of that cavalry was the lance. At its center stood the capo lancia, the elite knight, encased head to toe in polished steel plate, a mobile fortress. He was attended by his squire, also a skilled fighter, who cared for his weapons, armor, and spare mounts. There was also a page, usually a boy, responsible for minor tasks. Crucially, the unit was rounded out by 1 or 2 infantrymen, such as crossbowmen or men-at-arms on foot, who provided support. An army under a prominent condottiero might comprise 500 or even 1,000 of these lances, forming a core part of several thousand men. The sight of a Condottieri heavy cavalry charge was among the most terrifying experiences of the medieval battlefield. The ground shook beneath the weight of hundreds of war horses, many armored as well. They were the Renaissance equivalent of a tank division. Infantry, meanwhile, was a vital component. The crossbowmen, especially those from Genoa, were renowned for deadly accuracy. Shielded by men carrying huge wooden barricades, called pavises, they could loose bolts capable of piercing most armor at distance. Over time, inspired by the formidable Swiss formations, the Condottieri began adding large blocks of pikemen. These soldiers, wielding spears as long as 5 meters, could raise an impenetrable forest of steel, able to halt any cavalry charge. There were also men armed with halberds, a versatile weapon that could cut, thrust, or hook a rider from the saddle. Gradually, a new and frightening addition appeared in the ranks, the arquebusier. Armed with one of the earliest handheld firearms, his arquebus was slow to reload and inaccurate, yet its ability to punch through even the heaviest armor at close range heralded a new age of war. That blend of troops let the Condottieri employ combined arms tactics with remarkable effectiveness. They were masters of military science, poring over ancient Roman texts by authors such as Vegetius to learn logistics, formation, and strategy. They viewed battle not as a chance for chivalric glory, but as an exercise in risk management. Every soldier, especially an elite knight and his warhorse, represented significant capital. Losing them recklessly was bad business, a fact that led to an approach many contemporaries, most notably Niccolò Machiavelli, harshly criticized. Machiavelli, in The Prince and the Art of War, argued that Condottieri fought lukewarm, indecisive battles. He accused them of prolonging wars to keep drawing pay, avoiding real combat to preserve their armies, and cut secret deals with one another. There is some truth in that. Battles often consisted of long maneuvering spells, each side seeking positional advantage, severing the other supply lines, or luring the foe into error. A successful campaign might be one with very little bloodshed. Yet to brand all their battles theatrical is an oversimplification. When circumstances demanded, or when a contract specified a decisive outcome, the Condottieri could be ferocious, and the clashes extraordinarily bloody. The Battle Castagnaro in 1387, where Verona's forces were utterly destroyed by Padua's under John Hawkwood, was an outright massacre. The rivalry between the great generals Braccio da Montone and Muzio Attendolo Sforza produced showdowns of relentless brutality. The truth is that the Condottieri were versatile. They could be cautious or savage, depending on what the situation and the contract required. While armored cavalry remained their flagship arm, they did not ignore innovation. Artillery, for instance, transformed siege warfare. Old trebuchets were replaced by enormous bronze bombards that could hurl massive stone balls against castle walls. But field artillery marked the real tactical revolution. Condottieri, such as Bartolomeo Colleoni, pioneered lighter, more mobile guns on the battlefield, posting them to fire through gaps in their own infantry line, a devastating tactic against an advancing enemy. They understood that mastering technology meant mastering the battlefield, and, therefore, winning richer contracts. This role produced men whose ambition and skill became legendary, figures so charismatic and powerful their names read like those of epic novel heroes. They were the celebrities of their age. Sir John Hawkwood, the Giovanni Acuto of the Italians, was the prototype of the successful condottiero, an English cobbler's son who became one of Italy's most feared generals. His cunning was unmatched. He excelled at feints, ambushes, and night marches, outthinking opponents as much as outfighting them. He amassed an immense fortune and died a wealthy, respected man in Florence, which honored him with a gigantic funerary fresco in his cathedral, an extraordinary tribute to a foreign mercenary. If Hawkwood was the prototype, Francesco Sforza was the masterpiece. Son of the great condottiero Muzio Attendolo Sforza, he inherited his father's army and ambition. Serving Duke Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan, he proved his worth time and again. In a masterstroke, he wed to the Duke's illegitimate daughter, Bianca Maria. When the Duke died without a legitimate male heir, Milan proclaimed itself a republic. The new republic, in a twist of irony, hired Sforza as its own general. He led the city's army to crush its foes, and then, seizing his moment, marched on Milan itself, forcing its surrender. In the year 1450, the mercenary hired to defend the city became its ruler, the Duke of Milan. He proved as adept a statesman as he was a soldier, bringing peace and stability with the Peace of Lodi in 1454. At the opposite end of the spectrum stood Federico da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino. With his unmistakable profile, marked by the loss of an eye in a tournament, he was famed as one of the most reliable and brilliant condottieri. Yet his enduring fame comes from his role as a towering patron of the Renaissance. He transformed tiny Urbino into a beacon of culture, attracting artists such as Piero della Francesca and architects who built his magnificent palace. His library ranked among Europe's largest. Federico proved that the hand brandishing the sword could also cultivate art and philosophy. For more than 1 century, these men dominated Italy. But by the late 15th century, the world they mastered began to crumble. The catalytic event was the French invasion of 1494. King Charles VIII of France crossed the Alps with an army unlike anything the Italians had seen. It was not a mercenary company, but a national army, bankrolled by the wealth of a unified kingdom. It was larger, and more important, it brought a terrifying innovation: a mobile artillery train. Lighter bronze cannon, mounted on improved carriages, could be positioned and fired rapidly. They hurled iron cannonballs, not stones. The iron did not shatter on impact, but pulverized the medieval walls of Italian castles that had withstood sieges for centuries. A fortress a condottiero might have once defended for months could now fall in days. The first great battle of this new era, the Battle of Fornovo in 1495, was a shock to the Italian system. An Italian League army, composed largely of condottieri troops, vastly outnumbered the retreating French host. By traditional condottieri standards, they should have annihilated the French. Yet, the aggressiveness of the French heavy cavalry, the gendarmes, and the discipline of their Swiss mercenaries showed that a new type of total war had arrived. Although the Italians captured the king's baggage and declared victory, the French army escaped largely intact. It became clear that the cautious, maneuver-based tactics of the condottieri were inadequate against this new warfare. Technology and scale had changed the game. Swiss pikemen and German Landsknechts, combined with the growing firepower of handheld guns, could decimate the cavalry charges that were the condottieri trademark. Wars grew larger, longer, and infinitely costlier. Conflicts no single city-state could fund, nor any private contractor manage. Only the great national monarchies, France and Spain, now contesting Italy, could sustain that level of military effort. The condottiero business model was obsolete. Thinkers, such as Machiavelli, furnished the intellectual rationale for the end of their era, arguing passionately that reliance on mercenaries had corroded Italy's civic and martial virtue. He dreamed of a citizen militia, a popular army that would fight passionately for its homeland. Though his dream did not materialize exactly as envisioned, his critique resonated. The future belonged to permanent national armies. The age of hired warlords was over. The condottieri vanished from Europe's battlefields, yet their imprint on history is indelible. They were no footnote, but a driving force in Italy's passage from the medieval world to the modern. Militarily, they refined warfare to a science of tactics and logistics long before national armies did. They created command structures, pay systems, and contracts that were precursors to modern professional forces. Men such as Francesco Sforza proved that military prowess could break the barriers of birth and class, allowing a soldier to become a sovereign. They remain complex, contradictory figures. To Machiavelli, they were a symptom of political disease. To citizens who suffered their plundering, they were little better than bandits. Yet to the princes and republics who employed them, they were a necessary, effective tool. In today's world, where private military companies once again operate in conflict zones across the globe, the story of the condottieri feels strikingly relevant. They were neither simple heroes nor villains, but a mirror of their time's ambition, ingenuity, and brutality. They were the true warlords of the Renaissance, and their echo resounds to this day.
Right in the heart of Vatican City, this small force band of soldiers in vibrant uniforms and ceremonial halberds is guarding one of the holiest Christian sites. They are the Pontifical Swiss Guard, a one-of-a-kind military corps with a varied and fascinating history dating back more than 500 years. From humble beginnings as Swiss mercenaries to devoted protectors of the Pope, the Swiss Guard has withstood the test of time, witnessing monumental historical events and successfully adapting to the challenges of the modern world. The Swiss Guard's history is inextricably tied to the Middle Ages Swiss military tradition. Nestled in the Alps, Switzerland was a breeding ground for masterful soldiers, renowned for their ferocity and discipline in battle. Their skill with weapons such as the halberd and lance turned them into a valuable resource for European powers looking to strengthen their armies. Geography in early medieval Switzerland was crucial to shaping local communities. Hemmed in by mountains and valleys, Swiss cantons developed a culture of self-sufficiency and cooperation. This urge for collective survival prompted the creation of local militias, formed by farmers and craftsmen who took up arms to defend their land against external invasions and settle internal disputes. Each canton had its own military rules and traditions, but all were dedicated to protecting their communities. These militias were trained with strict discipline and specialized in the use of weapons such as spears and halberds, which were effective against both enemy infantry and cavalry. The experience gained from ongoing local conflicts made Swiss soldiers highly skilled, even before they became professional mercenaries. In 1291, the formation of the Swiss Confederation was a watershed event that permanently changed the region's military organization. The League was established to face external threats, like the invasion of the Holy Roman Empire. This mutual defense agreement laid the foundations for broader military collaboration. This union was especially important for consolidating local militias into more organized armies, able to face foreign powers on equal terms. Swiss military excellence did not come about by chance, but was the outcome of strict combat practices and unrivaled discipline. Military training was conducted in communities, where each citizen was given a role to defend the community. Early on, young men were instructed to handle weapons such as spears, pikes, and halberds, and to fight in compact formations that maximized the group's effectiveness. Once again, one of the Swiss's most remarkable contributions to the art of war was the introduction and refinement of phalanx formations. Drawing inspiration from ancient models, these formations were typified by tightly packed rows of soldiers with long pikes, which could be as long as 6 meters. The tactical layout allowed the soldiers to form an almost impenetrable wall of spears, particularly effective against mounted horsemen. Such formations required not only intense training, but also mutual trust between the fighters, as the effectiveness of the phalanx relied on each soldier's ability to hold his position under pressure. This strategy built the Swiss into a fearsome force, able to defeat larger and better equipped armies. The Swiss phalanx remained a byword for invincibility for centuries and was emulated and admired by other nations. Their primary weapons included long pikes, which could grow up to 6 meters in length, allowing for precise attacks on enemy knights and infantry. They also employed halberds, a spear and axe combo that was particularly effective in hand-to-hand combat. For close-range situations, the Swiss also trusted short swords and daggers, ensuring versatility in different battle scenarios. Swiss soldiers' equipment varied according to their rank and resources. While many wore light armor to keep themselves mobile, others chose heavier breastplates for greater protection. Robust shields rounded out their arsenal, providing additional defense against projectiles and head-on attacks. This weaponry combination made the Swiss a highly adaptable and feared force on any battlefield. The Swiss's military success was built on discipline and cohesion. From training to the battlefield, each soldier grasped the importance of operating as part of a collective, rather than seeking individual glory. This esprit de corps was nurtured from an early age, cementing loyalty between unit members and assuring that each soldier was willing to risk his life to protect his comrades. This cohesion was evident on the battlefield in flawless formations and the ability to maintain order even under intense pressure. Every soldier had to rely on the next to hold the line and implement the trained tactics, which made the Swiss phalanxes almost insurmountable. Allegiance to the group and the leaders was also a crucial factor, which guaranteed that the Swiss kept their focus on their objectives, regardless of the odds. Swiss mercenaries' continued success on European battlefields was in no small part due to their ability to overcome noble forces and mounted knights with novel tactics. Knights had represented the military elite for centuries, relying on their heavy armor and powerful war horses. But the Swiss changed the battlefield by using compact, well-disciplined formations armed with long pikes and halberds, able to destabilize and defeat even the best-trained cavalry forces. Combining discipline, training, and weaponry meant that the Swiss were able to overcome opponents who, in many cases, were numerically superior. One notable example was the 1315 Battle of Morgarten, where the Swiss, taking advantage of the hilly terrain and using ambush tactics, defeated a much larger Austrian army. This proved their reputation as a truly formidable military force and highlighted their ability to turn seeming drawbacks into decisive victories. The Swiss' reputation as invincible soldiers quickly spread throughout Europe, and they became highly sought after by Italian city-states like Milan, Venice, and Florence during the 14th and 15th centuries. Political splintering and constant clashes between these city-states led to a demand for elite troops who could guarantee victories on the battlefield. With their proven discipline and efficiency, the Swiss were the ideal choice. Enlisted as mercenaries, the Swiss not only fought in important battles, but also played strategic roles in securing trade routes and maintaining internal order. Their prestige was so outstanding that they were often vied for by Italian rulers, with generous contracts and extra benefits offered to secure their services. This presence further cemented the image of the Swiss as an essential force in any significant military conflict in Renaissance Europe. Conscription into their ranks started at a local level, with entire communities contributing to form tight-knit units. Such units were often formed by men who had previously fought together in the canton militias, which boosted mutual trust and combat efficiency. The hierarchy was distinct, but leadership often seemed to reflect the rapport between commanders and soldiers, creating a camaraderie that reinforced esprit de corps. Each unit oversaw its own training and equipment maintenance, which encouraged remarkable self-sufficiency. This also meant that the Swiss could quickly adapt to battle conditions and the specific needs of their contractors. This decentralized system was one of the cornerstones of their reputation as a reliable and highly organized force. Swiss mercenaries' popularity was linked to the economic limitations of their homeland. With its mountainous terrain and scarce agricultural resources, Switzerland offered limited livelihood opportunities for its growing population. Turning into a mercenary was a practical solution for young men who sought ways to support their families, and at the same time, amass wealth and prestige. Foreign governments were ready to pay generously for the Swiss's services, which made mercenaryism a profitable occupation. Moreover, local communities often supported these ventures, as the mercenaries' earnings were frequently reinvested in the region, bolstering the local economy. Mercenaryism was not just an individual necessity, but also a vital component in the economic survival strategy of Swiss communities. The rise of the German Landsknechts mercenaries towards the end of the 15th century introduced a new impetus to the European military scene. Organized along similar lines to the Swiss, these mercenaries were equally disciplined and used similar infantry tactics, including the use of pikes and compact formations. The feud between the Swiss and the Landsknechts intensified as both groups fought for the best contracts offered by European rulers. This competition often turned into direct confrontations on the battlefield. The Landsknechts wanted to prove that they could equal or surpass the Swiss in skill and discipline. While the Swiss kept their upper hand in many respects, the Landsknechts managed to earn their place and eventually rival the Swiss in reputation and demand. One of the most outstanding characteristics of Swiss mercenaries was their unwavering loyalty to the contract entered into with their employers. No matter what the political circumstances or national alliances, the Swiss viewed keeping a contract as a matter of honor. This work ethic set the Swiss apart from other mercenary forces, many of whom often switched sides for better deals. Breaking a contract was seen by the Swiss as a stain on their collective reputation, which they avoided at all costs. This sense of loyalty allowed the Swiss to earn the trust of rulers across Europe, who knew they could expect their dedication until the promised obligations were fully met. This ethical approach also helped to cement their reputation as the most reliable mercenaries of their time, raising their demand in conflicts of all kinds. The Battle of Marignano was a watershed in the history of Swiss mercenaries. Facing the French army led by Francis I, the Swiss proved their skill and courage once again. But this time they found an opponent who knew how to exploit their weaknesses. The French use of artillery, together with a coordinated strategy of cavalry and infantry, was decisive in defeating the Swiss. The Marignano loss symbolized the decline of Swiss battlefield hegemony and the beginning of a new military era in Europe, where technology and strategic coordination came to play a more significant role. Notwithstanding their defeat, the Swiss retained their reputation as outstanding soldiers, but their uncontested supremacy began to be questioned. Marignano meant the end of an era and the dawn of new challenges for the Swiss mercenaries. One of the most distinctive traits of the Swiss mercenaries was their absolute loyalty to the contract signed with their employers. Quite apart from political circumstances or national alliances, the Swiss viewed the fulfillment of a contract as a matter of honor. Notwithstanding their success and reputation, the domain of the Swiss mercenaries began to decline in the 16th century. One of the major factors behind this change was the professionalization of European armies. As centralized states became more powerful and organized, they started to invest in the formation of standing armies, lessening their dependence on mercenary forces. This shift weakened the demand for Swiss troops, which had previously been indispensable. Also, advances in military technology, like the increasing deployment of firearms and artillery, began to overcome the traditional tactics employed by the Swiss. In Switzerland itself, the country started to dissuade sending its citizens to serve as mercenaries, afraid of the social and political impacts of this practice. With fewer recruits on offer and a decreasing demand, Swiss mercenaries slowly lost their prominent position on European battlefields. Out of many roles played by Swiss mercenaries, one of the most iconic was their hiring by popes to act as personal guards. In 1506, under Julius II, the Pontifical Swiss Guard was established, a unit designed to protect the Vatican and the Pope. The decision to hire Swiss was founded on their reputation for loyalty, discipline, and courage on the battlefield. The first Swiss contingent's landing in the Vatican was the start of a long-lasting relationship between Swiss soldiers and the Catholic Church. Wearing colorful uniforms that have since become iconic, the Swiss Guards have taken on the responsibility of protecting the Pope, the cardinals, and the Church's property. Their actions were particularly outstanding during the 1527 sack of Rome, when, facing a much larger army, the Swiss Guard sacrificed a considerable number of its members to allow Pope Clement VII to escape to Castel Sant'Angelo. The Swiss Guards have become a symbol of the Vatican's security and stability over the centuries. While the Guard's military role has diminished over time, their presence remains a living tradition, standing for centuries of dedicated and uninterrupted service. They not only contributed to the Pope's own physical protection, but also to strengthening the Church's image as an institution protected by men of integrity and commitment. Their history reflects the Swiss warriors' adaptability of their military skills to the ever-changing demands of the world, guaranteeing that their legacy lives on to this day.